Republican Constitution of 1963. The Prime Minister and the regional ministers met in May 1963 in order to discuss and settle constitutional issues. So the Conference of the Head of Government of Nigeria agreed to summon an all-party constitutional conference in Lagos to suggest the important changes that were to be made in the constitution. The all-party conference met in July 1963 and agreed that Nigeria should become a republic. What is a republic? A republic is a country that is free from external control, a sovereign nation. And it was agreed that Nigeria should become a republic and that the president of the republic should have the same powers and functions as the governor general under the Independence Constitution. Let's look at some of the main features of the first Republican Constitution of 1963. We had a republican form of government. There was a change to a republican form of government backed up by a new constitution. The constitution retained the parliamentary system of government, so there was no change in the system of government that we used in the Independence Constitution. We were still using the parliamentary system of government, which was the same system of government used during the time of the pre-independence constitution. Head of state. The president was the ceremonial head of state and he replaced the governor general of 1960. So under the Independence Constitution of 1960, it was called the governor general. Now under the Independence Constitution of 1963, now under the first Republican Constitution of 1963, it is now called the president, and the president was the ceremonial head of state. The queen was no longer the head of state in Nigeria, which is why we said, this is why we call it the first Republican Constitution. It is the first constitution that was made when Nigeria became a sovereign nation free from external control. Another feature of the first Republican Constitution is election of the president. The president of Nigeria was to be indirectly elected through the secret ballot for a period of 5 years, and the president was elected by the House of Senate, by the Senate and the House of Representatives sitting together. So it's not like what we have now, whereby the citizens themselves vote the president into government. What we had under the Republican Constitution of 1960 was an indirect election through secret ballot, whereby the Senate, the members of the Senate, of the House of Senate and the House of Representatives, they sit together and they vote for the president. And the president was to be elected for a period of 5 years. So when the president is elected, the president's tenure for the office of the president was 5 years. Powers of the president. The president was the ceremonial head and he had no real power. So the president was more like a figurehead president. He only performed ceremonial functions. He had no real power. We equally had the head of government. The head of government was the prime minister, and it was the one that really had the real powers. We also have the national parliament. The national parliament was made up of 44 members of the Senate and 312 members of the House of Representatives. Judicial Service Commission was abolished. We are still talking about the main features of the 1963 Republican Constitution of We are still talking about the main features of the first Republican Constitution of 1963. Judicial Service Commission was abolished. The appointment of judges was to be made by the president on the advice of the prime minister. When we looked at, when we're looking through our class on the Independence Constitution, to look through this class, please look through our previous videos. When we looked at these classes on Independence Constitution of 1903, we talked about the fact that the appointment of judges was to be done by the Governor General, but was on the advice of the Judicial Service Commission. Now, what we see in the first Republican Constitution of 1963 is the appointment of judges was to be made by the President on the advice of the Prime Minister. So, the Judicial Service Commission was abolished. Director of Public Prosecutions. This was brought under the public control of the executive. So, the Director of the Public Prosecutions was now under the public control of the executive arm. Abolishment of the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council. The Privy Council was abolished and the Supreme Court of Nigeria became the highest and final court in the Federation. What we had in the Independence Constitution of 1960 was, although we had the Supreme Court in Nigeria, the Supreme Court did not have the power to appeal. So whoever wanted to appeal their case, they had to go to the Privy Council in London. But now under the Republican Constitution of 1960, we see that the Supreme Court now became the highest and the final court of appeal now became the highest and the final court in the Federation. So there was also the abolishment of the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council. We no longer had anything called the Privy Council in Nigeria, and citizens who wanted to appeal their cases could appeal at the Supreme Court of Nigeria. The office of the Prime Minister was strengthened but remained answerable and accountable to the Parliament. So we still maintain the office of the Prime Minister, who is the head of government. The office of the Prime Minister was strengthened under the First Republican Constitution, but the Prime Minister is still remained answerable and accountable to the Parliament. Removal of a judge. A federal judge could only be removed by 2/3 majority of both the House of Senate and the House of Representatives. So before a judge could be removed from office, he had to be 2/3 majority of both the House of Senate and House of Representatives had to vote before a federal judge could be removed from office. Removal of the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister could not be removed from office except Parliament resulted in abuse of power or a vote of no confidence was passed on him by the House, and if he refused to resign, the Parliament would be dissolved. So there was also provisions for how the Prime Minister could be removed under the First Republican Constitution of 1960. The Prime Minister could not be removed except one, he abused his power. Or a vote of no confidence was passed on him by the House. So if a vote of no confidence is passed on the Prime Minister by the House, the Prime Minister could be removed from office. Or if the Prime Minister was found to abuse his or her power, the Prime Minister could also be removed from office. And if the Prime Minister refuses to resign or leave office, the Parliament would be dissolved. With this, we've come to the end of this class, and in the course of this class, we looked at the main features of the First Republican Constitution of 1963. We looked at and I also explained some of the differences that we could see in the First Republican Constitution of 1963 and the Independence Constitution of 1960. And with this, we've come to the end of the class, and I'll see you at the next class.